Yes, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another live stream. I am terribly sorry for the delay. There was something that came up, and it took way longer than I expected. Sadly, I had no control over the situation, so I could not speed it up. But we're here now, and I hope this is not too long a chapter. But who knows? Usually these streams are shorter anyway. Last week was just a outlier. But yeah, without further ado, because we're already late, let's hop into the chapter of the Spice and Wolf. Right. There was no need for elaborate tricks. First, Lawrence explained the objective. Unsurprisingly, Remilio's eyes became wide. You don't mean, he said. You don't mean, he said. I mean, exactly that, said Lawrence. But soon the common sense he would expect from a merchant running a trading company in Ruvenhagen showed on Remilio's face. It turned scornful as the master sat in a chair. I I understand your debt is a difficult one to repay, but I can't have you making such ridiculous chatter. He began to stand, as if unwilling to waste more time, when Lawrence stopped him. I'm sure there have been those who tried to smuggle gold in this way and were caught. Well, if you understand that, this will go quickly. It's easy, it's easy for someone on the brink of ruin to mistake a reckless plan for a perfect one. It occurred to Lawrence that this statement was half aimed at Remilio himself, but he continued undaunted. What if you could entrust it to someone especially talented at smuggling? Remilio, Remilio looked at Lawrence gravely and sat back down. What you propose is not possible. Someone so skilled as to be able to smuggle gold in would already be making plenty of money on his own. He wouldn't cooperate. If you plan to bring in someone from the outside, you might as well give up now. There's no end to gold smuggling plots like this. So inspections of anybody not registered within the city, inspections of anybody not registered in the city is especially thorough. Remilio's objectives are exactly the arguments Lawrence had been expecting. What if there is someone who was highly skilled but not making good money? If he is so skilled, finding work in the city is not difficult. There's already a shortage of labor. Remilio sat and waited for Lawrence's reply. His expression was faintly reminiscent of Hollow's the previous night. He'd given his objection and waited for Lawrence's counter objection. He wanted to give up, but couldn't. Lawrence took a deep breath. What if this skilled person had only ill-paying work in the city and a need for money? More importantly, what if this person's current employer left something to be desired? I'm referring to the church. Importing gold flies directly in the face of the church. Will not only offer the opportunity for profit, but exact some small revenge against the church. It will be irresistible, and the probability of betrayal very low, owing to a fair distaste for the employer. That's far too convenient a tale. That's when business is most profitable. Am I wrong? Procuring produce When a crop had been bad, buying fashions that go out of style only to find them booming in another city. The biggest profits are realized from the most impossible coincidences. Remilio's face twisted. He wanted to believe, but couldn't quite manage it. If I tell you this person's name, I think you will be able to accept it. In that case, why go through the trouble of coming to me and having another party demanding a share? Having established smuggling as a topic, Lawrence proceeded to entangle this tangible problem, setting aside issues of possibility or impossibility. There are two reasons. The first is that the debt I owe you is a company. I owe this company comes due today. At sundown, I will surely be taken into custody in lieu of payment. The second is that this is all the coin I have on hand. Lawrence produced the coin purse, untied its drawstring, and emptied its contents onto the table. It was a mixture of silver copper coins and totaling to 3 lumione. The coins glittered in Remilio's eyes. Remilio, who faced bankruptcy just as Lawrence did. It's 3 lumione. If you wanted to know how I raised it, just ask around the merchant houses. You'll find out soon. Hearing this, Remilio took a deep breath. Given the situation, he surely knew how Lawrence had collected the money. This is truly everything I have. I want you to take it as collateral and trust what I'm saying. Lawrence leaned forward and looked straight into Remilio's eyes. I also want you to suspend the payment of my debt and for your company to finance the purchase of gold for us to smuggle. Remilio's haggard face was covered in cold sweat. Wrinkles gathered at his chin. The only reason he didn't deny Lawrence and Holo on the spot was that he had just enough funds to finance the plan, and just enough hope to want to believe them. All it would take was one more push, but if Lawrence pushed too hard, it would only make Remilio more doubtful. Gold smuggling could yield enormous profits, but it came at a terrible risk. And given the current condition of the Remilio company, the deal to finance the smuggling could itself be seen as fraud. There were plenty of people willing to destroy a struggling company in order to make a quick profit, so these doubts were hardly strange. Lawrence had to choose his words carefully, but before he could... "Listen, you," said Holo. Surprised, Remilio looked at Holo, blinking as if only now realizing that he had brought someone else. Opening a window. Yes. Lawrence turned to Holo. Holo herself regarded the floor. "Do you think you have the luxury of wavering?" What? Remilio was tongue-tied at the provocative, threatening question. Thinking this as an unwise approach, Lawrence was about to stop her. However, another person left just now. Can you really keep dilly-dallying like this? Transfixed by a Holo's sharp look, Remilio froze as if he swallowed a stone. I've excellent hearing. Shall I tell you about your workers and their plans being hatched downstairs right now? Their plans to escape while they can? Oops, there goes another one. At this rate, the shop will be... Stop! Cried Remilio, clutching his head. Oliver regarded the man, her expression entirely unperturbed. Lawrence half agreed with her. The company was like a boat. If there's a hole in the hull, there's no hope of patching it. The crew ignored the captain and abandoned ship. and no hope of fetching it, the crew ignored the captain and abandoned the ship. But it was clear enough that Holo had chosen that line of attack for a reason. She knew better than anyone the meaning of the word loneliness. She certainly understood Remilio's distress. Mr. Remilio, began Lawrence mildly, having understood Holo's angle, I propose that you take these 3 Lumione, everything I have, as a deposit and invest it in gold. We know someone who will make the smuggling possible. If this person is paid well enough, trustworthiness is assured. And given your company, I'm sure you have means to move smuggled gold. What say you? If you'll postpone my loan and give me a fair portion, I want to conduct this operation with no unfavorable conditions placed on you. A moment passed. What say you? Remilio looked down, head in hand. Lawrence's words were more seductive than wine. More seductive than wine were surely filtering through the man's mind now. He still hadn't looked back up. Time silently passed. It was quiet, as if the entire company was focused on Remilio's decision. Just as Lawrence began to say, Mr. Remilio, the master finally spoke. All right! He lifted his head, his face exhausted, a flame burning in his eyes. Let's do it! Lawrence stood up without thinking and extended his hand. The 2 men, both of whom faced bankruptcy, shook. May God forgive us. After settling the arrangements regarding roles and compensations, with the Remilio Company, Lawrence and Holo found themselves in front of a smallish church in the eastern part of Ruvenhagen. The level of ornamentation, the size of the bells, and so on were decided based on the chapel standing within the church organization. The reasoning behind that higher the abbey, the closer to God it was. The church Lawrence and Holo visited was at the bottom, in the bottom middle of the hierarchy. Its adornment was not all that poor, but for Ruvenhagen the church was rather subdued. It was just after noontime, and the midday service was in progress within the parish. Now then, said Holo abruptly, sitting on the stone steps as a hymn praising the Holy Mother waved out the chapel. You think you can really pull one over on the girl? Such things you say. Am I wrong, then? Lawrence made a stern face and stared straight ahead as he answered. You don't change. He and Holo waited at the entrance of this house of worship, because they had business with Nora, the shepherdess. They did not know which church in particular she affiliated with, but there weren't many that housed a female shepherd. Their search had been quick, and having gone through all the trouble of searching, they weren't here to make idle gossip. They had come to ask her to play the crucial role in gold smuggling operation, the carrier. However, Nora was not facing financial ruin the way that Lawrence and the Remilio Company were. Still, proposing the gold smuggling plan would certainly involve deception, because they would need to make the profit that would come with the plan's success seem equal to the danger. Any who smuggled gold bet their life on it, and nothing could compensate for loss of life. Yes, some fudging of the details would be necessary. Yet both Nora's skill as a shepherdess and her standing in the city were indispensable to their scheme. And the merchant had faith that she would be their accomplice. Lawrence felt a pang of conscience as at treating someone's heart as a commodity in the marketplace. If Nora had been a merchant, he would have no such compunctions. But she was an innocent shepherdess. Nonetheless, the fact was not lost to Lawrence's keen merchant side. In addition to being a shepherdess, and thus regarded as vaguely heretical, she was a woman, which made her all the more likely to be a tool of demons. It was simple to conclude that the church was not sheltering her out of the sense of charity, but rather to keep an eye on her. That was probably the root for her unease, which he had picked up on when talking to her about the shepherding work she did for the church. Also, though Nora had expressed her desire to save up enough money to become a dressmaker, it was not in the girl's personality to be avaricious. Avaricious. And the extra income afforded by doing escort work did not give her that luxury. He could understand if she didn't want to be exposed to rather harsh work environment, toiling the day away doing the difficult work of a shepherd, yet never quite making ends meet. It would be impossible to greet the morning with any joy. The future would stretch out endlessly ahead, holding only bitterness and suffering. In contrast to that, Lawrence would propose the gold smuggling stratagem to her. Rather than scraping tiny amounts of money together, she would make enough in one fell swoop, not to only pay her guild membership dues, but also to end any worries about making ends meet. Sure, there was danger, but how could he let this opportunity pass? Could she let this opportunity pass? This was how he would persuade her. Lawrence would hardly force her, so in that sense he wasn't doing anything wrong, but he still had misgivings about using her adverse circumstance in this fashion. Nonetheless, it had to be Nora. The fact that she was a skilled shepherdess who could lead her small flock through wolf-infested areas where few humans ventured. The fact that she was unsatisfied with her employer, the church. The fact that she needed money to fulfill her dream. It truly seemed like every condition was divinely arranged, specifically to help Lawrence succeed in smuggling gold into Ruvenhagen. It was impossible to imagine anyone in a better position to help them. Yet Lawrence heaved a heavy sigh. Convincing her still weighed on him. While he was absorbed in thinking about it, Lawrence grew conscious of Hollow's eyes on him. He looked over and saw her grinning at him resignedly. You really are just too soft-hearted by half. It was what she had said yesterday. It was true that Lawrence was quite sentimental for a merchant. There were plenty of merchants who would happily bring misfortune to their families if it meant making money in the process. Still though, said Hollow, standing and looking out over the ever-lively city streets. It's thanks to that soft-heartedness that I've been able to travel so easily, she announced casually, descending a couple of stone steps to stand next to Lawrence. I suppose I'll have to talk her into it. I need to be of some use after all. She gave a thin smile, but her words lacked a certain spark, Lawrence thought. He studied her, and sure enough, her eyes were downcast. Maybe it was because he and Hollow were close to the boisterous busy lane, but it seemed smaller than usual. She seemed smaller than usual. What, are you still thinking about yesterday? He asked. Hollow shook her head but said nothing. It was an easy lie to see through. There's no telling what would happen back there if you hadn't leaned on Remilio. I say you were plenty useful. Hollow nodded. Perhaps she accepted the truth of the statement, but her face remained crestfallen. Lawrence patted her head lightly. I'll talk to her myself. It was my eyes that were blinded by greed and gotten us into this mess. After all, it'd be absurd to make you do all the talking because of my reluctance. Though he was half trying to cheer up Hollow and half being derisive, everything he said was certainly true. And anyway, if I let you help too much, there's no telling how much I'll be taken off advantage later, he said with a shrug. After a moment, Hollow looked up and smiled with a soft sigh. And here I was thinking I'd be able to call in some favors later. I certainly avoided quite a trap there, joked Lawrence. Hollow casually put her arm to her forehead. Indeed you did, but you're backing into a still larger trap. I don't hunt a rabbit caught in a trap. It would be too feeble. Do you know the sort of wolf snare that uses a trapped rabbit as bait? Make sure not to cower at the wolf's howls when you set the trap. You'll foul the snare. You'll foul the snare else. You foul the snare else. It was the empty banter of familiarity. Lawrence shook his head at the ridiculousness of it, although couldn't contain herself anymore and started laughing. Anyways, merchants are like sabers. They're no good if they're not straight. They break otherwise, said Lawrence, mostly to himself, and then he cast his eyes into the sky. As if searching for the sound of the bells. It was a beautiful blue sky with scattering of clouds. He shifted his gaze to the east and spied even more a few more white clouds. It was a fine day. A fine weather meant good business. As Lawrence considered that, he heard a quiet knocking sound behind him. The chapel doors were opening. Lawrence and Hollow backed away to the sides of the stone steps. Soon the congregation began to filter out of the church, their faces full of post-prayer serenity as they descended the steps. The crowd divided into smaller groups as they dispersed to finish the day's work, a scene that repeated itself daily. At length, the exodus subsided. There was once a time when it was groundlessly believed that the longer one remained in the church, the deeper one's faith, until the priest started becoming angry with anyone who lingered in the chapel. Now, such things did not happen. That said, it was not good to leave the church too quickly, lest it seemed like one was trying to escape. As a result, butchers, tanners, and other craftsmen likely to attract the church baleful attention tended to leave the sanctuary more slowly. As shepherds were counted among those suspicious professions, the shepherdess was last to leave. Her downcast eyes, reserved posture were no doubt due to the fact that the church was not a place of rest for her. "A good day," declared Lawrence as he stopped in front of Nora. Smiling as pleasantly as he could manage, a good smile was important. Was an important part of the negotiation.
Lawrence? And Holo, yes?
said Nora, reddening slightly and looking over at Holo, then back to Lawrence. It is clear that us happening to meet in front of the church is the will of God, said Lawrence, with a slightly grandiose gesture. Nora seemed to notice something and giggled in amusement. I won't be fooled, Mr. Lawrence. And thank the heavens for that. I have heard that lately there are those at service who have drunk a bit too much of the holy blood. Lawrence was referring to wine. Were she drunk, he might be able to convince her to join him, but she might also lose her nerve or turn him down. He was glad for her sobriety. I cannot drink much wine, so I mostly avoid it, she said with a shy smile, then looked around nervously. Perhaps she had been contacted with an offer of escort work. Lawrence did not hesitate to use that expectation. Actually, I'm here about some work for you. Nora's face lit up so quickly that he could nearly hear it. This place being what it is, perhaps we should away to a stall somewhere. The reason Lawrence didn't suggest a bar was because nothing would be more conspicuous given the hour. Secret negotiations were best conducted in a busy public place. Nora nodded agreeably. Lawrence began walking with Holo at his right side and Nora at his left side. At his left, trailing behind him slightly. The three strolled along the busy, boisterous lane until they passed through the crowds and arrived at the plaza. The plaza was as loud and festive as ever, but fortune smiled on them as the trio found a table at a beer stall where Lawrence ordered a beer for the lot of them. Ale was cheaper, but Nora was with them. He couldn't very well order any. The service was quick but rough as the three cups arrived. Lawrence paid a pittance in silver for them, but then put his hand to his mug. Here's to our reunion. The tankards clacked together noisily. So, Nora, did you say you were about to go as far as? Did you say you were about to go as? Were able to go as far as Lantra? Taken off guard by such broaching of the subject of work, Nora, who hadn't touched her beer, eyed Lawrence guardedly. Holo watched the two nursing her drink. Yes, I can go as far. I can go that far. Even bring your flock? As long as it's not too large. She answered so directly that Lawrence wondered how many times she had crossed the fields and the forest on her way to Lamtra. But just to be sure, Lawrence glanced to Holo to check the truth of the statement. Holo nodded to so imperceptibly that only Lawrence could tell. Evidently, Nora was not lying. Lawrence took a deep breath to avoid arousing Nora's suspicion. Being excessively roundabout might damage her resolve. Better to plunge straight into it. I want to hire you for a certain job. Compensation will be 20 limione. Not in a cheap banknote, of course. It will be hard coin. Nora looked at him blankly, as though he were speaking in a foreign tongue. In fact, it took time for the words to penetrate her mind. It was as if they had been written down in some faraway land and sent to her. To some people, 20 limione was that much money. However, there is a risk, and the compensation is only if we succeed. Failure earns us nothing. Looking at someone's finger as it traced circles or X marks on the table was one way of telling if he or she was real or not, and not a dream or a hallucination. Nora followed the movements on Lawrence's finger, and it seemed that he was quite real. Yet Still, she had trouble believing it seemed. The job will be then moving sheep and then back again as safely as possible. That will be all we need of your services as a shepherd. Nora finally seemed to wrap her head around Lawrence's proposal, and realizing that the work and the compensation had been offered were far from comparable, she began to voice her skepticism. Lawrence seemed to have been waiting for that and cut her off. However, the work itself involves significant danger, proportional to the risk. Having explained the unimaginable profit, he now explained the risk. Both could inspire shock, but the first detail would leave a stronger impression. Nevertheless, the pay is 20 lumione. Even the highest guild dues are but a single lumione. You could rent a house, take care of your daily expenses without a worry. With that much, you could easily buy your own business. You would be the mistress of Nora dressmakers. Nora's face was troubled and then on the verge of tears. The enormity of the amount of money seemed to be sinking in, and with it, undoubtedly, the concern over the danger. She had taken the bait. Now the real challenge began. If he muddled his statements at all, she would clamp a shell around her like a clam. Oh, that's right. Had you planned to join the Tailors Guild in the city, Nora? She was waiting. Prepared to hear the bad news, but Lawrence seemed to have thrown her off the trail. Inside her head, Lawrence knew thoughts raced of both the ridiculous amount of money and the fact that she had not heard the risk yet. There wasn't much room for her to ponder extraneous things, so her answer should be quite honest. Lawrence thought, No, I was thinking a different town. I see. Do you not like the sprawling size of the city compared with others? It can be quite hard to live in an unfamiliar city with no friends to find. While her mind was occupied with other matters, she couldn't easily voice her thoughts. Such was the plan. Nora nodded, looking troubled, saying nothing. That was enough for Lawrence, whose merchant intuition told him a person's heart based on the expression of their face. The shepherdess's mind was like glass to him. Well, I suppose you'll want to get away from the city and its churches, won't you? The trap was set. Hollow gave Lawrence an obvious look, but the result was instantaneous. No, not at all. Well, but... The harder you work for them, the better you protect your sheep. The sheep, they've trusted you. The more they'll suspect you of witchcraft, am I wrong? She froze, her head moving neither up nor down, left nor right. Lawrence was spot on the mark. And as they try to expose you, you'll have to venture where other shepherds would never go, because the alternatives are already taken by those self-same shepherds, you said. That instant, Nora's eyes snapped wide open, and she looked at Lawrence. Perhaps it was something she had vaguely considered before, since even if other shepherds had their territories, if she was willing to travel far enough, there would be safe places that remained. The priest will keep pushing you farther away until you're attacked by wolves, or maybe other mercenaries. And every day you're not, they'll suspect you of being a pagan. Lawrence clenched his fist under the table as if to crush his guilty conscience. He had lit a fire under the small doubt that had always lingered within Nora's heart. There was no way to take it back. Whether it was true or not was irrelevant. Merchants are like sabers, useless unless straight. I've been in a similar situation myself. Let me say it plainly. He looked at Nora and spoke in a voice just low enough for the people around him not to hear. The church here is lower than pigs. Speaking ill of the church was a serious crime. The shocked Nora peered around. The flames of her doubts suddenly scattered. Lawrence placed his elbows on the table and leaned forward. But we have a plan. We'll give the church some trouble, make some money, and head to a different town. That kind of plan. The flames of her doubt turned to anger and burned hotter, but once they burned out, they would leave behind the cinders of confidence. Within Nora, the seed of justified defiance would begin to flower. Slowly, Lawrence articulated the heart of the matter. We will smuggle gold. Nora's eyes widened, but soon she calmed herself. Surprise could at best only be felt as a slightly strong wind. She finally spoke, her mind working again. But what can I possibly do? It was a good question. Her skill as a shepherd wasn't her only merit. As I'm sure you know, gold coming into the city is heavily regulated. Every road that enters Ruvenhagen has checkpoints and 2 stages of examination. If you hide something in your sleeves or among your luggage, they'll find it on the spot. If you're trying to bring a lot of something, it's even harder. Nora nodded fervently at Lawrence's plain explanation, as though she was a devout believer listening to a sermon. We plan to get gold past the checkpoints by hiding it in the sheep's stomachs. The look on Nora's face was so astonished that Lawrence could practically hear her say, "Impossible!" But the notion gradually percolated through her mind, like water sinking into hard clay. Many animals that eat grass year-round, including sheep, tend to swallow stones in the process. There was no reason not to scatter grains of gold among the grass and have the animals swallow them. Though they might cough up gold during the long inspection process. And then there was Nora, who, despite her skill as a shepherd, had but a small flock that she took far afield, wandering places where few humans traveled. When coming in from Proson, the first checkpoint was a modest one. Heavier traffic would be a larger scale checkpoint. Nora nodded slowly. I see, she murmured. But gold prices are absurdly high in any city affected by Ruvenhagen's policy. That makes the pagan town of Lantra the most convenient place from which to start. If you come via the safest routes from Lantra, there's a lot of traffic, and much of that territory has been claimed by other shepherds. This is what makes you perfect for the job. No one will find it suspicious that you're bringing your sheep through a low-traffic route, and that route is the quickest path from Lantra to boot. Lawrence paused, clearing his throat slightly and looking carefully at Nora before continuing. You've suffered at the hands of the church in this city, Nora, he said sharply. This is your best chance to turn the tables on them. The church's 2 biggest sources of income are tithes and the gold trade, after all. But if we're caught, the punishment will be heavy, and once the job is done, we'll have to leave the city to be safe, and depending on the circumstances, we may have to ask you to butcher the sheep. There were few shepherds who had never had to butcher an animal, and still fewer who didn't find the job painful. It was a good way to measure her resolve. On the other hand, it's 20 Lumione, Lawrence said. You're being unfair, he told himself, but the more unfair her situation seemed, the more effective the result. Finally, the girl across the table from him, who had endured heat and cold, suspicious gazes, and terrible treatment, all the while silently tending her flock, weighed the profit, risk, nature of the job, and seemed to come to a conclusion. Lawrence could see her eyes before become calm. Strong words were uttered from the small mouth. Please, let me do it. In that moment, Lawrence had convinced another person to make a bet with her own life. Yet he swiftly aligned himself with Nora and extended his hand. His hand. It was that hand that had reached out for his own future. I shall count on you. And I on you. Now the promise was firm. Nora and Hollow shook hands as well, and now the three of their fates were inexorably linked. All three would laugh together, or all three would weep. Right, now for the details. Lawrence then asked Nora about when she would take the sheep and how many she would take, the specifics of the landscape around Lamtra, and how much gold she thought she could compel the sheep to swallow. He would take this information to the Remilio company. Midnight passed in a twinkling, and by the time they finished talking, business was ending and the merchants and craftsmen appeared in the streets on their way to home. Having left her beer untouched, Nora stood. She had absorbed everything while entirely sober, and made her decision. If Lawrence had thought otherwise, he would have followed Nora when she left, giving her parting thanks to the man who had brought such an extraordinary opportunity. He would have tried to convince her to rethink her position. Lawrence drained the lukewarm beer in a gulp in the cup in one go. It was bitter and unpleasant. Come. Should you not be more happy? Everything has gone well and yet said Hollow to Lawrence with a wry grin. And Lawrence could not be unreservedly happy. He had persuaded Nora to choose a dangerous path. I don't care how great the profit. Nothing exists to balance out the wager of a person's life, he said. I suppose that's true. And just talking up the profit like that, it's the same as fraud. Merchants have always said that it's a fool who is bound by an unfair contract. But what is she? Just a shepherdess. Though all he had done was raise his voice, regret swirled within his chest. If all he cared about was survival, he could have accepted Hollow's help, abandoning his life as a merchant and all the people in it. But Lawrence was not that very different from. But to Lawrence, that was not very different from death. So he had leaped at the heaven-sent chance to turn Hollow's scheme into reality, tricking Nora into helping him. Knew what he had done, but couldn't help regretting it. Come now, chided Hollow after a time, swirling the remaining beer around in her cup as she stared at its contents. Lawrence looked over. She kept her attention focused on the cup. Have you heard the terrible cry that a sheep makes when you tear out its throat? Lawrence's breath caught at the sudden question, while he finally faced him. Sheep have no fangs, no claws, no teeth with which to escape when wolves come flying across the fields like arrows with claws and teeth, and speed to tear their throats. What do you think of this? Hollow spoke as if making everyday conversation, and in truth, she was. What she talked about happened frequently, no, more than frequently. One hunted one's food with every method available. It was simply obvious. The death cry of a lamb is indescribable. Yet my empty stomach complains constantly. If I must listen to them, I'll lend my ear to the louder of the two, will I not? Lawrence understood. If having to sacrifice something in order to survive was a sin, then the only path remaining was to die while fasting as a saint. But that didn't excuse just any behavior. It took someone else saying what he needed to hear in order to free himself of conflict. You're not so very bad. Lawrence saw Hollow smile at him helplessly and felt his black guilt melt away. He had very much wanted to hear those words. Such a spoiled boy. Lawrence made a grim face at having been seen through so easily, but Hollow just finished off her beer and stood. Neither humans nor wolves can live alone. Sometimes one needs a packmate to curl up with. Am I wrong? Surely this was the definition of flexible strength. Lawrence nodded in acknowledgement of Hollow's smile and stood himself. Still, you're quite a dangerous one, she said. He was probably talking about his skillful manipulation of Nora. But a fine merchant would be able... but a fine merchant would he be if he could not do at least that much? You best believe it. Watch yourself lest I trick you as well. Hollow giggled. I look forward to that. She laughed as though she truly did anticipate it, which made Lawrence wonder if he was not the one being led on. He didn't want to say it, but Hollow let slip a private smile when they began to walk. It seemed best to assume she could see right through him. In any case, we've no choice but to try and make sure we all end up laughing, said Lawrence. That's the spirit. Lawrence looked at Hollow, who had trailed off in mid-sentence. Would it not be better if... would it not be even better for the two of us to have the last laugh? It was a seductive notion, but no better that everyone was happy. You really are just... you're really simply too soft-hearted. Is that so bad? Far from it. The two smiled slightly as they walked through the city. The road ahead was far from bright, but each sensed in the other's face that the future was clear enough. Smuggling would succeed. The thought was unfounded, but Lawrence believed it anyway. My name is Martin Liebert from the Romilio Company. Lawrence, and this is my companion, Hollow. I'm Nora Ardent. The church city of Ruvenhagen had many entrances and exits, and it was in a plaza just before the northeast gate that the three introductions were made. The morning air before the market bell rang was crisp and pleasant. And the plaza, though it still cluttered with litter from the previous night's commotion, was somehow beautiful. Among the people gathered there, only Hollow had the luxury of looking at the city. The faces of the other three were drawn tight with nerves. The crime of smuggling gold into Ruvenhagen carried a heavy punishment, up to and including being drawn and quartered. Ugh. Under normal circumstances, they would have met many times to ensure that there there were no unpleasant surprises. But unfortunately, the situation did not allow that. There were many creditors who wanted to crush and devour the Remilio company. Even a firm facing bankruptcy had, had land and houses and accounts receivable, all of which could be converted to money. These creditors could hardly wait for the loan deadline, so the Remilio company was under pressure to finish the gold smuggling quickly and turn the results into coin. Thus, Nora picked up her sheep from the church right after the morning services, then headed immediately to join up with the others. Evidently, she had not expected anybody besides Lawrence to be involved and was surprised to hear the Remilio company's name, but she kept any doubts to herself. She seemed prepared to play her part. Let us go then. Business is like fresh fish in the kitchen, declared Liebert. Declared Liebert. Liebert was the man Hans Remilio had entrusted with the role of smuggling in gold. Lawrence had no objection, and of course neither Nora nor Hollow seemed opposed. Arousing only the slightest curiosity from the sleepily yawning guards at the gate, they left the city of Ruvenhagen without incident. Lawrence wore his usual mercantile clothes. Liebert dressed in kind of traveling clothes a city merchant might not wear on a hunting trip. Hollow had returned to her nun's outfit, and Nora looked as she always did. However, neither Lawrence nor Liebert used a wagon. Liebert sat astride on his own horse, and Lawrence had put Hollow upon another horse, which he led by the reins as he walked. The road was likely to be poor, and traveling without a wagon was significantly faster, with Nora leading the way as she guided her 7 sheep and her sheepdog, Enek. The group headed northeast to the town of Lamtra. It was like the road from Poroson. The route was unpopular with travelers, and the group went the entire day without encountering so much as another person. There was nothing worth calling conversation, and the only sounds were the bell on Nora's staff and the bleating of her sheep. The first interaction that even approached the conversation came at sunset when Nora stopped and began to make camp, which Liebert took issue with. With his almond-shaped eyes, the smooth blonde hair, he was in every inch the spirited young employee entrusted with an important job. He advocated in a rather high-strung fashion for making more progress before stopping to camp, but Liebert lacked travel experience. Once Lawrence explained things like how shepherds work at the risk of nighttime travel, Liebert was surprisingly understanding. He may have been high-strung, but he was by no means unreasonable. Far from it, in fact. Lawrence realized Liebert was probably a good-natured man under normal circumstances once he offered a sincere apology. I'm sorry. The pressure is getting to me, I think. Liebert had been entrusted with the continued existence of the Remilio company. Sealed securely inside of his coat was a note for buying up gold in the amount of 600 limione. Even his master, Remilio, was probably clasping his hands in prayer back in Ruvenhagen. Well, unlike me, you're carrying an entire company on your back. It's to be expected, said Lawrence. Liebert looked slightly relieved and smiled. The night passed quietly, and soon it was morning. Among townspeople, breakfast is often regarded as a luxury, and many do not take it, but for those who live by travel, it's a common sense. Thus, they set off with all but Liebert chewing away on a flatbread and jerky. They stopped again just before noon. It was just at the crest of a small hill. The road beneath their feet headed straight east. Straight east, bending south at the summit of the next hill. All around them grew grass, ideal for grazing. It stretched out in every direction, but the road now was turned away from their destination. Faintly visible to the north was a green line of the forest, and tracing that line west, they could see the craggy faces of the steep hills in the distance. They would be heading between the hills and the forest across the fields. There were no wagon rolled, no traveler's foot trod. The field divided the craggy hills, which were so rugged that they were impassable even on foot. From the thick, eerie forest that even the knights hesitated to enter, were the quickest path to Lamtra. No one in their right mind would take that route, which, despite its entirely mundane appearance, was ineffably terrifying. Though Holo sniffed at rumors of pagan sorcerers summoning wolves, it was hard to not wonder at them. Unless they navigated the pass and arrived safely in Lamtra, and unless they had returned with gold, none of them had a future. Their faces met, and they all nodded with unspoken understanding. If we encounter wolves, do not panic. We will arrive safely, said Nora, with surprising resolve. It was reassuring, though Holo did not seem to find it at all amusing. No doubt Holo the Wise Wolf had something to say. When Lawrence met her eyes, she sneered slightly, but she soon regained her composure. God's protection be with us, Liebert prayed. The rest followed suit. The weather was good. There was an occasional wind that stirred the cold air, making it brush against the travelers' cheeks. But as they were walking, it was easily ignored. Nora headed up the group with Liebert on horseback. Behind them came the 7 sheep, and trailing the sheep was Lawrence, leading the horse on which Holo rode. The farther north through the forest that they headed, the closer the hills drew, nudging them toward the forest's edge. They kept as close to the forest as they could, since the horses might injure themselves on rockier terrain. However, as they got close enough to make out the gloomy form of the forest, its eeriness grew. It was hard to say, but Lawrence thought he might just have heard a wolf howl. Hey, do you think wolves will be a problem? He asked, lowering his voice. No good. We're already surrounded. Even that obvious joke made his breath catch in his throat for a moment. Holo chuckled soundlessly. I can guarantee your safety. The others, I don't know about it. We'll be in trouble unless everyone's okay. I truly do not know. The forest is downwind. If there are wolves, they've long since noticed us and started sharpening their fangs. Lawrence suddenly got a feeling that something in the forest was watching him. He heard sudden patter of animals' footfalls, and surprised, he turned to face the sound, seeing Enoch run past him in a blur of black fur. Enoch chased after 2 stray sheep. Clever dog, said Lawrence. He had not meant anything by it, but Holo still sniffed in irritation. Being only half clever only invites death, she said. What do you mean? He asked. It would be complicated if Liebert or Nora ahead of them were to overhear the conversation, so Lawrence spoke in a hushed voice. On the horse above him, Hollow wore a sour expression. That dog. It knows what I am. It does. Hiding my ears and tail will only fool will fool humans, but not a dog. Ever since we met, it's been looking at me with a most irritating way. Lawrence could tell Enoch had been looking at them, but he had not realized why. But here, what really irritates me, Hollow flicked her ears beneath her hood. She was quite angry. Is that the dog's eyes? Is that dog's eyes? Those eyes, they say, you just try touching the sheep, I'll rip your throat out. Oh my god. Lawrence smiled awkwardly, as if to say, surely not. The flinty-eyed look he got from Hollow made him wince. Nothing makes me so angry as a dog that doesn't know its place, said Hollow, looking away. Perhaps dogs and wolves were enemies in much the same way that crows and doves were. And anyway, I am Hollow the Wise Wolf. I will not fall for some mere dog's provocation, she complained with a scowl. It was nearly impossible not to laugh. But since it would be a problem if Hollow got angry, Lawrence stifled his chuckle. Indeed, the dog is no match for you. You're stronger and smarter, and your tail fur is much finer. It was obvious flattery, and the last compliment seemed to work. Hollow's ears pricked up beneath her hood, and her face broke into a proud smile. There was no mask of composure could hope to hide it. Mm, to hide. She giggled. Well, I see you understand the way of it then. It was true, Lawrence did understand by now how to handle Hollow. But of course he didn't say that and only inclined his head in a vague bow. Eventually the grass grew sparse and the ochre soil more prominent. The hills that spread out to the west were closer than ever and looked like an angry sea. The group continued down the road, though it was barely rated as such, when they had to cross large tree roots and occasionally slowed progress. Soon the sound of the wind through the trees reached their ears. Yet still they pressed onward, passing the second night of the journey without incident. According to Nora, if they left at daybreak the next morning, they would reach Lamtra midday. Thus they would have to spend less than half the travel time than it would normally have taken to use the established route. Their route was much closer to a third or a quarter of the distance if the path was cleared. Trade with Lamtra would If the path was cleared, trade with Lamtra would become simple. Looking back on the distance they had covered thus far, Lawrence realized that wolves had not been a problem, and it was easy to wish there was a more proper road. Of course, the road would also make Lamtra much more susceptible to assault. Ruvenhagen would find it hard to tolerate a pagan city situated so close. That had not happened yet, which made it easy to suspect that Lamtra secretly paid Ruvenhagen specifically to prevent such a road's construction. Wherever there is power, there is also bribery, after all. After a bland dinner, Lawrence sat deep in thought as he sipped some wine Liebert had brought. With no one to talk to, he was left on his own devices. Hollow had quickly finished her own wine and was now wrapped up in a blanket, leaning against Lawrence, fast asleep. Liebert, tired and unaccustomed to travel, dozed off before the campfire. Lawrence looked around and spotted Nora a bit farther from the campfire, stroking Enoch on her lap. Evidently, if she stayed too close to the fire, her eyes would become accustomed to the light, and that would cause problems. If something were to happen. Nora seemed to notice Lawrence looking at her. She glanced over at him. She looked down at her hands and then back up, smiling pleasantly. For a moment, Lawrence didn't see why she was smiling, but then he looked down at his own hands and understood. Otto snored away on Lawrence's lap. The same as me, Nora's smile said. Lawrence thought I was quite afraid to stroke Hollow's hair. The wolf on his lap was much more fearsome than Enoch. As he looked at Hollow, peaceful and innocent as she slept, the temptation to caress her grew keener. Surely there would be no problem if he mimicked Nora with Enoch. Liebert was asleep, and Nora minded her sheep as she tended to Enoch. Lawrence set down the roughly hewn wooden cup he held and slowly moved his hand toward Hollow. He had stroked her head many times before, but suddenly now it seemed almost sacred. His hand trembled, and at that moment, Hollow lifted her head up. Lawrence hastily withdrew his hand. Hollow eyed him warily, but soon turned her attention elsewhere. What? Okay, YouTube? Oh, that's what happened. Sorry. Give me a moment. That was weird. Okay. Never mind. Lawrence wondered what was happening when he noticed that Nora had gotten to her feet, as had Enoch, teeth bared. Everywhere he looked it was the same, pitch-black forest. "Mr. Lawrence, get back!" shouted Nora, urgently and mostly by reflex. The merchant tried to do as he was told, but he was caught on something and could not stand. He turned to find that Hollow was holding fast his clothes, keeping his hands behind him. He was about to protest when a warning glare from Hollow over his shoulder pierced him. If he had to guess, the look was something like, "Ignore the girl and get behind me." Hollow seemed to harbor an intense hostility toward Nora and afraid to oppose her when Hollow stood. Lawrence stayed behind her. Nora was absorbed in her own work, ringing the bell on her staff and directing Enoch, rounding up the sheep and bringing them closer to the campfire, and then tapping the sleeping Liebert on the shoulder. Finally, she threw several more pieces of firewood onto the campfire. Nora's movements were practiced and calm, and her awkward manner around other people reminded Lawrence of his own clumsiness when dealing with people outside of business. Liebert finally awoke, and sensing the tense atmosphere, followed Nora and Hollow's gazes, searching for wolves. He retreated, hand clutching his chest, no doubt feeling for the 600 limione note that was concealed there. As he got behind Enoch, whose tail fur was standing on end and bared his fangs, the camp's defense arrangements settled. The only sounds that remained were the uneasy baas of the sheep, Enoch's ragged breathing, and the crackling of the campfire. There was no sound from the ebony woods. The moon was out, and there was no wind. Naturally, being a merchant, Lawrence could hardly sense any presence in the forest. But Nora, Enoch, and Hollow were utterly motionless, and they looked into the woods. For all he could tell, they might have been staring at a catfish swimming in a black pond. Strangely, he couldn't hear so much as a hint of a wolf's howl. Lawrence had been attacked by wolves many times in his travels, and such attacks always came with howls, and yet none were audible. He wondered if there were any. Time crawled with an agonizing slowness. There was no baying. The only reason Lawrence could keep his guard up was Hollow. He trusted her implicitly, and she was still the very picture of seriousness. Liebert, seeing Nora and Hollow as mere girls, was another matter entirely. The color returned to his previous frightened pale face, and he began to cast his gaze here and there doubtfully. There was movement the instant he opened his mouth. Nora held her staff in the crook of her right arm, and with her left hand took hold of the horn affixed to her side. Hollow saw the gesture and was amused, perhaps because wolves and hunting horns were ever in conflict. Just as wolves howled and bears scratched themselves on trees, shepherds announced their presence with a blow of a horn. No animal could reproduce that long, drawn-out note, which unmistakably betrayed the presence of the shepherd. The note rang out in the night and was swallowed by the forest. If there was indeed wolves nearby, they now knew that a skilled shepherd was among them. But still, no howling rang out. The group's opponents maintained absolute silence. Did we chase them off? Asked Liebert uncertainly. I'm sure not. At the very least, they seem to have backed away. Liebert knitted his brow at Nora's vague answer, but seeing Enoch stop baring his teeth and set about the work of rounding up the sheep, he accepted that immediate danger had passed. Perhaps he had decided that animals understood other animals. The wolves in this area are always like this. I hardly ever hear them howl, and they do not seem to attack. They just watch. The young employee from the remedial company paled at Nora's words, as though she had been talking about corpses returning to life and rising from their graves. Liebert was more timid than he looked. "'Tis a bit strange. They don't even howl," murmured Hollow. Still, looking into the forest, Liebert gave her a skeptical look. This town girl was who wasn't even a shepherd. What did she know of wolves? It wasn't that Liebert had especially bad disposition. Many townspeople were like this, but their assumptions still grated on Hollow's nerves. It could be odd besides wolves. It could be odd besides wolves, for example, the spirit of a traveler who had died here. Liebert's face went sheet white. The wise wolf had exposed his cowardice. Still, Hollow tugged at Lawrence's sleeves once she had finished teasing the poor lamb. Her voice was slow, so Lawrence leaned down to put his ear at her level. I was half serious. I have a bad feeling. This journey was no ordinary one. They had to make it to and from Lantra. If the group failed, whether they ran or met their fate, Lawrence's life as a merchant would be over. He gave Hollow a baleful look as if to say, "Don't try to frighten me with foolish stories." But she just vaguely surveyed the forest. Apparently, she wasn't joking. We seem to be out of firewood, said Nora brightly, perhaps to dispel the still tense atmosphere. Lawrence agreed, and Holo finally averted her gaze from the forest and nodded. Liebert nodded as well, probably mostly out of a sense of obligation. I'll just go and gather some then, shall I? Said Nora, perhaps confident in her night vision. Lawrence felt bad for leaving it to her. I'll come as well. Holo chimed in. As shall I. Not knowing the first thing about starting a campfire, Liebert had not raised a finger to tend it. But now he must have felt entirely ill at ease. I'll help too, he said, clearing his throat, afraid of being left behind alone. Holo smiled unpleasantly at him. They walked into the forest to gather firewood, and Lawrence wondered if the bestial aura he had felt was just his imagination. Yet there were no further incidents, and the night passed quietly. When Lamtra finally came into view, Lawrence breathed a sigh of genuine relief. With the deep forest to the right and the rugged hills to the left, their passage had been akin to going down an endless black valley. But his sigh of relief did not come from reaching the end of an alley. He had experienced far worse trails many times in the past. Now the relief came from the fact that the strange gaze he had felt upon him in the previous night was gone. Lawrence knew that it wasn't simply his imagination, since Holo and Nora had been continuously on guard as well. There was definitely something within the forest that separated Ruvenhagen and Lamtra. Something that even the night brigades feared. Even so, they had made the trip out successfully, so the return trip should also be possible. Lawrence was still uneasy about it, but Nora was with them, and she had made the trek many times, never been attacked once, relying on her shepherding skills as well as Holo would see them through somehow. Then all they had to do was bring in the gold. Lawrence was in deep thought as he watched Liebert head into the town to make the purchase. There was no point in the lot of them filing into Lamtra. I hope everything goes well, said Nora, no doubt referring to Liebert's task. So far, everything they did was perfectly legitimate, so there was little worry about, but pointing that out seemed excessive. Indeed, said Lawrence. There was a reason he used his best merchant smile when he said this. Nora was simply making small talk, but in Lawrence's heart, misgivings mingled with regret. He worried that Nora didn't truly understand the consequences that awaited them if they were to fail. The shepherdess before him was the one who would be in most danger when they moved the gold. The gold would be hidden in the stomachs of her sheep. When they passed the checkpoints, if one of the sheep were to happen to cough up any gold, the shepherd responsible would face immediate punishment. In contrast to that, if Liebert and Lawrence were to keep silent, they might be able to make it through the checkpoint. There was a huge difference in their risk. He wondered if Nora understood that. Lawrence looked on as Nora tended to her flock, as at the other time, patting Enoch when he returned to her side after performing this or that task. The merchant felt he needed to ascertain Nora's awareness of her peril. It simply did not seem as though she grasped the difference between what could happen to her compared to what happened to the people around her might face. If so, taking advantage of her ignorance was not far from fraud. Lawrence considered this and concluded that his consciousness was most definitely somewhere near the pit in his stomach, where Nora to learn what she would be, what, where Nora to learn what she would be made to take the fall if caught. She might refuse to cooperate, turning a cold shoulder to them. That had to be avoided. Thus Lawrence kept silent. Now that I think of it, Nora piped up, jolting Lawrence out of his reverie. However, when he lifted his head, he saw that she was not speaking to him. Nora looked at Hollow, who had plucked a single stalk of tall grass and was now wandering about aimlessly. Miss Hollow, I mean... Nora hesitated after speaking Hollow's name, perhaps needing to muster up more courage to speak to her. Lawrence had noticed Nora trying to engage her female companion several times, but Hollow's curtness made her hesitate. In his mind, he encouraged her, but he was genuinely surprised at the words that came out of her mouth next. Do you know a lot about wolves? Lawrence was shocked for a moment, but Hollow, ever the canny wise wolf, did not alter her expression a bit. She finally tilted her head curiously at Nora. I mean, just last night you noticed the wolves so quickly, so I... She trailed off. There, perhaps because she wondered if Hollow had experience as a shepherd. Were that the case, it would be like one white crow finding another. One rare shepherdess meeting another would make for a lively conversation. If so, Hollow's unapproachable attitude left few opportunities to speak up. What? I simply noticed them, that's all. Oh, I mean, the men are generally useless after all, said Hollow with a mischievous smile, glancing at Lawrence, who gave a small shrug in reply. Don't you think? I don't... So you think you can count on that? Prodded Hollow, pointing sharply. Nora followed her where Hollow indicated, only to meet Lawrence's eyes. In that moment, Nora looked genuinely awkward as she averted her eyes. Hollow asked her again, and Nora glanced apologetically at Lawrence as she whispered something to Hollow, who had drawn near the shepherdess. Given the cheeky wolf's smile, it had to be that kind of answer. Lawrence watched and realized the conversation was about to turn farcical. He waved his hand back and forth as to admit defeat, while Hollow and Nora laughed. In the first place, it is not strange to ask someone like me, traveling alone with a man, knows a lot about wolves. Going by looks alone, Nora appeared to be the older of the two girls, but as soon as Hollow spoke, she took the upper hand. She put one hand on her hip and held up the index finger in the other, looking for the world like a theologian giving a lecture. You see, the answer is completely self-evident because... Because? Nora leaned forward as if to say, because come nighttime, a wolf will always appear tempted by this helpless, adorable rabbit. Surely you'll agree that a rabbit who is devoured by a wolf every night could not fail to know something about wolves. Nora looked blank for a moment, but soon understood what Hollow meant. Her face turned beet red as she searched back and forth between Hollow and Lawrence. Then, embarrassed, she looked at her feet. Hollow giggled. Ah, it was a lovely reaction, but no. My first answer is the one to remember, she said, delighted, at which Nora blushed to her ears and averted her gaze as she seemed to remember something. It then sounded like she raised her voice in a quiet, "Oh? In truth, it's my companion that's more like the rabbit. If I left him on his own, he'd likely die of loneliness," Hollow whispered into Nora's ears. But her voice was loud enough to reach Lawrence quite distinctively. He gave Hollow a bitter smile, but it was Nora's credulous nodding that hurt the most, as if he really seemed that way. But in any case, I just happened to notice the wolf last night. In truth, it was not an obvious conclusion, but Nora had been sufficiently confused by Hollow at this point that she seemed to accept it. She put her hands to her cheeks. The blush was now subsiding and nodding. Then, taking a deep breath, she spoke. Her nervousness evidently dispelled. Actually, I thought you were a shepherd, Miss Hollow. Oh, because I was quick to notice the wolves? Well, there's that too, admitted Nora, pausing to look at her black-furred companion, who was content to pause his work while his mistress had her chat. Actually, it was because Enoch seemed to be very aware of you. Is that so? Hollow, whose nerve was such that she had no trouble exposing her tail when she had no trouble exposing her tail when she knew she would not be caught, smiled, totally unperturbed as she folded her arms regarding Enoch. It's hard to say in front of a pet dog, but I dare say he's smitten with me. As if he had heard her, Enoch looked back to Hollow and then struck out once again to tend the flock of sheep. His mistress, on the other hand, was struck dumb by Hollow's words. What? You mean Enoch is? My, it's nothing to be sad about. Any male will get overconfident if spoiled. I'm sure he's quite important to you, but that only makes him feel secure that he's gained your affection. There's no mistake he'll go looking for others to frolic with, no matter how delicious the bread. Sometimes she wants soup. Oh my god. Perhaps feeling some sympathy with Hollow's intricate argument, Nora nodded, apparently impressed. Put another way, sometimes you have to be called. It's good. It's a good leash. Nora nodded firmly, as if she had been told some deep truth, but then called Enoch's name and crouched down to greet him. She caught him head on as he streaked over to her, then looked up to Hollow and smiled. If he ever has an affair, I'll keep that in mind. Good. The wrongly accused Enoch barked once, but Nora put her arms around him and he was soon calm. I think I'd like to indulge him as long as I can, though, said Nora, lightly kissing Enoch behind his dangling ears. Hollow looked on, a slight smile playing around her lips. It was somewhat bemused smile, inappropriate for the occasion. Lawrence realized when Hollow looked at him. Whether this job goes well or fails, I'll be giving up my work as a shepherd, said Nora quietly. as she held in her arms. It was clear that she had a firmly rational grasp of the situation and was prepared to act accordingly to that understanding. She understood both the position she had been placed in and the likely outcomes. Lawrence's concern was unnecessary. Though Nora might have looked frail, she had survived being cast out of an almhouse, and lived through any number of difficulties. She was no pampered noble's daughter. At the same time, Lawrence had renewed respect for Holo. She had discerned Lawrence's misgivings, and after seizing the conversational initiative from Nora, casually drawn out the evidence of how prepared the girl was. That explained Holo's bemused smile earlier. The merchant wondered if Holo's pronouncement that men were generally useless was not necessarily of the mark. Lawrence covered his eyes in defeat and then sprawled out on the ground to rest. The autumn landscape was cold with the approaching winter, but the scattered clouds in the sky looked warm. The smuggling would succeed. Lawrence muttered encouragement to himself as the sheep meandered over and peered down at him. After some time, Liebert returned, riding his horseback at a leisured pace. When one carries a large amount of money, he will see everyone around him as a thief. But true to his position as a trusted employee of a trading company in a big city, Liebert appeared unperturbed. He produced a bag of gold grains just large enough to be held in one hand, and after all present had confirmed the bag's content, Liebert tucked it into the inside of his jacket, patting it lightly. Now all we have to do is make it back safely with this and feed it to the sheep at an opportune time, he said, as if to emphasize that any real problems would be from here on out. Then, once we've gotten through the gates, the sheep will be received as previously discussed. Are we agreed? We are, said Nora with a nod. Liebert faced straight ahead. Then let us go on. A golden tomorrow awaits us. The small band headed back into the narrow path between the forest and hills. The next morning, Lawrence opened his eyes as he felt something cold on his face. Is a sheep licking me again? He wondered, but he saw only the lead-colored sky. Evidently, there was going to be a rare autumn rain. And it was cold. Lawrence lifted his head off the tree root he had been using as a pillow and saw that the fire had gone out. In order to have a small gap between the time Nora went to sleep and everyone woke up, one person was tasked with having Nora awaken them early to tend the fire. That person was supposedly to have been Liebert, but he lay there snoring away, firewood clasped in his arms. It was so foolish that Lawrence could hardly be angry with him. Lawrence sat up, apparently awakening Holo, with whom he had shared a blanket. Without so much as a good morning, she shot him a truly withering glare and yanked the blanket away. If you're awake, you don't need it, seemed to be her logic. If he argued the point, she would likely become genuinely angry. Although it was a bit early for him, Lawrence forced himself up. He had to toss another log onto the campfire. The sheep were all huddled together from the cold, and with no work to do, Enoch slept stretched out by the cinders, nestled up to his beloved mistress, of course. Lawrence stood, joints creaking, and tossed a log into the fire to get it started, glancing wearily at the comfortable-looking Enoch. As the dry wood began to crackle in the fire, Enoch yawned contentedly. Lawrence smiled. It reminded him of Hollow. Still, it was cold. It was cold. It was as if the winter had suddenly arrived. The cause was obvious to Lawrence, looking at the weather, but as he as they would be arriving in Ruvenhagen at midday the next day, he wanted he had wanted to sorry. He had wanted to hold it until then. But the sky seemed unlikely to wait. Lawrence sniffed bitterly. Rain would likely fall by the afternoon, surely by evening. The trees were thick enough in the forest that the group could probably take shelter under them, but with the sheep along, that was hardly an option. The forest was an ominous one, too. Lawrence was not terrified of it, but neither was he eager to spend the night. There, using the edge of the trees as a rain shelter would be quite close enough. Lawrence thought it over as he gazed into the growing campfire, and then something suddenly loomed over his back. He didn't have time to turn around before a familiar face appeared directly behind him. It was Hollow, with the texture of a tree root she had slept on and still imprinted on her face. "'Tis warmer over here." Lawrence was not so humble as to take those words purely at face value. Hollow wrapped a blanket around Lawrence's back and deliberately huddled under with him again, stealing the blanket away as well as was well and good, but perhaps she had decided that it was excessive. Hunger and cold were every traveler's companion, and after all. But as Hollow had said nothing to apologize, Lawrence said nothing by way of forgiveness. He stirred up the embers with a stick, then tossed it into the fire. "Oh, that's right," he said casually. "Didn't you say you could predict the weather? Surely it will rain just past midday today." She replied sleepily. Anyone could tell that, looking at the sky, teased Lawrence. Instead of scowling, Hollow bumped her head against his shoulder lightly. "Wish we could take a fast horse and make it to town before the rain. Anyway, what say you to some potato soup? It's been warming by the fire." "I have no complaints. Also, your tail grooming, right?" said Lawrence, lowering his voice even further. Hollow sighed and nodded. "I want to return to the inn as soon as we can, though." Her face was melancholy as she looked up to the sky. A chill wind blew through her bangs and she narrowed her eyes, as though it had touched her long eyelash. "A rain is coming, though I haven't wished it so." It was then that Lawrence remembered. When he had met Hollow, she had been the harvest god of a bountiful area. Farmers hated a chilly rain during the harvest months of autumn. So though she was far from the wheat fields now, such weather was not something she could welcome. Though Hollow herself hardly had good memories of the wheat fields, owning too many things that had happened there. Owing too many things that had happened there, she had still been the god of the harvest. It didn't take a harvest god to find the cold rain distasteful. In the worst case, the rain might turn to sleet. Lawrence got cold just thinking about it, and he briskly tossed another log onto the fire. There was a bit more time before everybody woke up, yet he still hadn't realized something. Holo never said anything meaningless. Ah. And that is the end of another chapter. I think the next one's the last one. A bit later than usual for the reading, but stuff happens. Right. I think I'm gonna close it off anyway. And chapter is done. Next week we'll read what I think is the last one. But yeah, I still have some schoolwork to finish, so... Yeah. Thank you all for watching. And enjoying my stumbling over words. Tomorrow we'll continue with Jacuzzi. Yakuza! Play Yakuza! Yes! And Thursday, XCOM. Because XCOM give it to ya. I'm sorry. But anyway, without further ado, I'll wish you all a very good night. Sleep well. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye bye.